Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that gleefully drops ice cubes down Hollywood's vest. I'll be your detective, and today we're going to be talking about Inception. But first, as always, the case notes. At some point after making Insomnia, Christopher Nolan began writing an 80-page treatment for a movie about dream stealers, influenced heavily by The Matrix, Dark City, 13th Floor and other similarly themed distorted reality science fiction pictures that were in vogue at the time. Whilst initially conceived with more of a horror premise in mind, the project eventually shifted to resemble that of a heist film, as he felt that the emotional content in a horror premise tends to be more superficial, which was not what he felt he needed to make the movie work. What Christopher Nolan did feel he needed was to find a way to raise the emotional stakes of the story, so the themes inherent to the premise began to take centre stage, making the story more so about the ideas of dreams and memory rather than the team's cooperation in pulling off the job. The subsequent years of Christopher Nolan's career would see Nolan rewriting the script on and off for a period of 9 to 10 years, whilst meeting with Leonardo DiCaprio during this time as someone he had in mind for his lead character. In 2001, Christopher Nolan made the pitch to Warner Brothers, but then soon realised he had not had much experience with big budget movies before and instead decided to sit on it for a while, during which time he made Batman Begins, The Prestige and The Dark Knight for WB. By the time The Dark Knight had hit theatre screens, the movie had done mega business for Warner Brothers, giving the studio more incentive to trust Christopher Nolan with any future projects. Soon thereafter, Nolan repitched his treatment, now titled Inception, and by February of 2009, Warner Bros. Had bought it. Principal photography began on location in Tokyo in June of that year, with Wally Pfister returning as director of photography once again, shooting largely on 35mm with key sequences photographed in 65mm rather than the IMAX format the Dark Knight's action sequences were shot in. The production had to accommodate a huge-scale shoot, as Nolan had intended to tell a story that felt as infinite as the human mind, by utilising as much practical effects work as possible to give the abundance of sequences present in the script a tactile sense of weight, and using CGI only as a tool to expand upon imagery already mostly shot in camera. Inception saw its premiere on July 8th of 2010, afterwards receiving rave critical reception and made back its $160 million budget within the first 3 weeks, eventually racking up a little over than $292 million by the end of its 25-week theatrical run. And again, much like Memento, it's a picture that many critics and audience members have debated the meaning of, and in particular its ending, since its initial release. Warner Brothers basically decided to give Inception to Christopher Nolan as a massive thank you present for making them upwards of £500 million on The Dark Knight, and it paid off for them spectacularly once again. So let's investigate, shall we? Essentially what we're looking at here is his first pure Christopher Nolan movie since Following, as he once again is unburdened by adaptation or adhering to studio guidelines. Inception is a rare kind of animal, as it's something that doesn't fit particularly neatly in one box. A science fiction film, I suppose, is the broadest outline of what you could describe the movie as, but that's doing it a fair bit of disservice, in the same way that Blade Runner being described similarly doesn't exactly tell you much about that movie either. It has all the trappings of a film noir, in that there's a femme fatale and a lead protagonist who's a professional at something quite seedy when you get down to it, but it's also an action thriller with massive set pieces, costume and set design that wouldn't look too out of place in your average spy movie. But on top of that, it's also a psychological character piece about one man dealing with the fragile memories of his deceased wife. So it's kind of like On Her Majesty's Psychiatric Service. Okay, so the plot basically goes like this. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Cobb, a man who specialises in dream sharing, specifically extraction, the process of stealing secrets and information from within a subject's dreaming mind, a job he undertakes with a partner in crime, Arthur, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. When we're introduced to both, they're in the middle of a job extracting information from a wealthy businessman by the name of Saito, played by Ken Watanabe, in a mission that goes awry when Cobb's deceased wife, Mal, played by Marion Cotillard, turns up and sabotages the job. It turns out, though, that this doesn't really matter, as Saito had set up the extraction job on himself as an audition for a far bigger job that he's eager for Cobb and Arthur to undertake, the job in question being the title of the movie. The Inception job entails breaking into the mind of Cillian Murphy's Robert Fisher character, the heir to a massive international energy conglomerate owned by his ailing father, played by the late Pete Postlethwaite, and implanting an idea deep enough into his subconscious that he'll decide to dissolve his father's company. If Cobb is to succeed at this no small task, Saito will use his power and influence to clear him of a murder charge, allowing Cobb to finally return home and see his children, thus giving him the incentive to put together a team consisting of Ellen Page's Ariadne, Tom Hardy's Eames, and Dilip Rao's Yusuf to commit the heist of the century. I think it's safe to say that whilst Inception is essentially Christopher Nolan Unchained, it also feels like his most ambitious film as well as his most personal. What's particularly of note is the time difference between when Christopher Nolan first wrote the script and when he eventually made the movie itself, as what we have here is a screenplay that has all the trappings of early Christopher Nolan, i.e. existentialism, identity issues, Sartre and film noir, turned into a movie that has all the polish of something directed by a late period Christopher Nolan post Dark Knight. As befits another film where Christopher Nolan gets to let loose and talk about whatever he feels like talking about, this is where we find ourselves revisiting themes from The Prestige. If the nutshell of the story story is about a group of professionals who bring ordinary people into fabricated realities with the aim of telling grand lies in order to change people's consciousness, then Inception can't really be seen as anything other than an extended metaphor for filmmaking itself. Functionally, every creative work is like this. You're not actually in Hogwarts, you're staring at very carefully placed ink blots and stapled together bits of paper. You're not really killing orcs and goblins with a sword in Skyrim, you're tapping away at a plastic pad which corresponds to actions on a screen. And of course, you're not really watching Cobb and Ariadne chatting inside Ariadne's imagined version of Paris. We're actually on location in Paris watching Leonardo DiCaprio and Ellen Page recite predetermined lines in front of a camera with a film crew standing behind it. What's most interesting about how Nolan tackles the theme of dreams versus reality in relation to cinema is the way he frames the story. It's ultimately the realism of the character struggle, that of a man dealing with his collapsing unconscious after the death of a loved one, that gives the story all of its weight, even though Nolan frames it very much like a spy thriller, like a movie, and by extension, a dream. And it's this interesting contradiction that makes Inception such a fascinating movie. As they go deeper and deeper into the dream eventually reveals to Cobb something truthful about himself, and similarly the constructed layers of the dream convince Cillian Murphy's character to do something he would otherwise not have done. A lie to tell the truth, not unlike a movie. So essentially what Nolan has done here is attempt to concoct something that begins to resemble a kind of postmodern action movie. Of course, whereas writing is a one-person job and the creator can be represented in metafiction by a single protagonist, vis-a-vis 8.5 and various others, filmmaking is a hugely collaborative process, with the final film being the product of not one imagination but several. So it makes sense that Nolan chooses to build Inception around an ensemble cast of different actors with differing roles. These characters can be seen as analogous to members of a production team for a film, with Cillian Murphy standing in as an effective proxy for the audience. We have our executive producer in the form of Saito, as he's the employer that's holding all the money. Arthur as our producer, as he's tasked with making sure the operation goes smoothly. Yusef, who's either special effects or cinematography, as his job is maintaining the believability of the dream state. Eames as our actor, for obvious reasons. Ariadne as our screenwriter, as much like her mythic namesake guides the rest of the characters through the mazes constructed for the mission. And finally Cobb as our director. This interpretation is one of the more popular on the internet, as for me it's the one that holds the most water, but a question still remains. Who exactly is Mal in this context? As far as the screenplay goes, Mal is the wildcard on account of whom the stakes of the mission are raised. Her presence in the story actively corrupts the narrative as bits of Cobb's subconscious leak through into the dream, destroying the illusion. Her presence is very much unwelcome in order for the job to go down smoothly. So if Mal is a very deeply held element of Cobb's subconscious that is prohibiting him from creating a grand fabrication for the audience at the behest of an executive producer, then I can't help but see Inception as a meta-narrative about this time and place in Christopher Nolan's career. He had just done mega business for Warner Brothers on The Dark Knight and was now given an opportunity to make whatever he wanted again. And it feels like this time he decided to make a film about why he hadn't made anything like this film sooner. When you're working under the studio system, there's a tension between creating something you're personally satisfied with and adhering to the will of the studio, who at the end of the day own and or are funding the thing that you're making, especially if you're working on a well-known intellectual property like Batman, for instance. That's why it's so common for directors or screenwriters to have the reason for abandoning a project be creative differences. See in particular the news of Michelle McLaren leaving the Wonder Woman movie because she wasn't towing the company line. And I think that's what Mal represents. That niggling doubt in the back of a creative person's mind when working on a project for someone else, that perhaps your heart isn't quite in it or that you have more important matters to attend to. The core of the story, and I mean that in the most literal way, is Cobb coming to terms with his past actions and trying to absolve himself for what he did to his wife, in a scene that takes place in limbo, which is for all intents and purposes outside of the borders of the story, in what is as close to breaking the fourth wall as Inception gets. Limbo looks and feels so out of place with the rest of the story that it almost looks like a collection of assets from a development kit for a video game. It's a very important character moment for Cobb and functions as the emotional crux of the film, but Nolan decides to frame it in a very non-movie context. These scenes don't really feel much like the high-style car chase or the spy thriller hotel room or the explicitly James Bondy ski resort shootout, but those other scenes are ostensibly built on top of Limbo, and Limbo is where the truth is revealed for its central character. A thing to watch out for when revisiting the movie is the prominence of trains. To Cobb, trains represent a necessary but unpleasant wake-up call, as literalised by the moment when he and Mal first came out of Limbo after all that time, as well as a symbolic elephant in the room at key moments. Notice how when Ariadne wanders through Cobb's memories that it's only after she sees the train that we're then shown Cobb's worst nightmare in the form of the moments before Mal's suicide, as if the train is some kind of mental underline. Also notice Cobb's discomfort when waking up at the beginning of the film after the Saito job. Speaking of Saito, there's that repeated line at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end.
Do you want to take a leap of faith? Or become an old man, filled with regret, waiting to die alone?
You're gonna become an old man,
Filled with regret.
waiting to die alone.
I'm an old man, filled with regret, waiting to die alone.
From his point of view, there's a distinction made between the skilled but unambitious work which is the bread and butter of his trade, and taking the risks and accepting the challenge of attempting true inspiration, as Arthur puts it. Perhaps this could be seen as an analogy for Hollywood filmmaking versus cinema as art, or in other words, sure success versus risky experimentation. To create something truly world-changing, Cobb's team have to go deeper down into the dream, working at the levels of raw emotion, instinctive creation and instinctive truth. In doing so, Cobb not only enables Fisher to change his perspective on his father, but in the process comes to confront his own personal demons. So there's also the idea that by going deeper as a filmmaker, Nolan is not only allowing the audience to discover things about themselves, but he's also discovering truths about himself also.
As we go deeper into Fisher, we're also going deeper into you.
Maybe this is why he chose that musical countdown as the motif for the kick. Edith Piaf's 1960 recording of Non Je ne regrette rien, which translates from French to I regret nothing. And incidentally, that track is used as the same kick for the audience during the credits, signalling to us that the dream is over and it's now time to return to reality.
Non, rien de rien.
But whilst Inception presents the problems inherent to creating purely for someone else, it also presents the problems inherent to indulging in one's own personal fantasy. This is kind of what Inception means by Mal in the broad strokes of her involvement in the plot. In Mal's story, she and her husband wanted to experiment with creating their own dream reality together and accidentally ended up in limbo, at which point fact and fiction blurs into incomprehensibility. Her reality becomes the fantasy, and at that point her perception is highly susceptible. Concluding that perceiving the falsehood of one's own fictional reality whilst experiencing it has huge psychological drawbacks, Cobb ultimately decides to bring the two out of their shared dream world. He does this by planting an idea in Mal's head that reality is just one level above them and that their children are waiting for them at home. The problem is that once they get there, Mal can't stop believing that reality is just another suicide away. Her perception of reality becomes distorted and she kills herself, but not before framing Cobb for her murder as a way of coaxing him into committing suicide by her side. Essentially what this subplot demonstrates is the idea that fictional realities by their very nature, no matter how realistic they present themselves as, can easily become the subject of misinterpretation. Perhaps this is another excuse as to why Christopher Nolan hasn't made anything as financially risky as his earlier works on a grand scale up until this point. Especially now, after working on 3 massive money-making blockbusters in the financial comfort of the studio system, why would you risk a gamble on a movie that deliberately builds its entire narrative around the very nature of ambiguous storytelling? That having been said, we did spend the entirety of the last review discussing the problematic philosophical underpinnings in The Dark Knight, but hopefully you know what I mean. So Inception, much like The Prestige, ultimately aims to have a conversation about the rules of its own conception. That's no small task, so the plotting deserves some close examination. The great difficulty with a story like this is that the amount of things happening across multiple streams of plot and across several different locations coinciding with each other is that it's terribly easy for the audience to get lost to the point where the term clusterfuck ceases to be accurate. I'm looking at you, Southland Tales. So the filmmaker at the helm must, and this is a big must, have a handle on the story through the composition and especially through the editing. And what makes magic happen is that Inception is amazingly well edited. In fact, the opening 15 minutes do a really good job of establishing the characters, their relationships to one another, the story rules and the theming before any of the exposition gives greater clarity later. Seriously, have a look at the Saito job at the beginning without the context of what the main plot is. It's really something to behold from a screenwriting standpoint. And whilst we're on the subject of editing and writing working together, there is of course that scene at the cafe. Ariadne's dream world begins to collapse the minute she realises she's dreaming, and it's just as disorientating for her as it is for the audience.
Let me ask you a question. You never really remember the beginning of a dream, do you? You always wind up right in the middle of what's going on.
I guess, yeah.
So how did we end up here?
Well, we just came from the,
Think about it, Ariadne. How did you get here? Where are you right now?
And the reason why it works is because the movie makes its audience aware of its own editing and plays up the discomfort accordingly. And how it works is actually deceptively simple. We've got these 2 scenes between Cobb and Ariadne, one which takes place on a rooftop and the other takes place in front of a cafe, which are bridged by this seemingly innocuous moment where Arthur is setting up chairs in a warehouse. Now, narratively, we should be aware of what's happened here. Cobb and Ariadne went from the roof to the warehouse and now they're in the dream in front of the cafe. But if you place a bit of audio from the next scene before you cut to it...
They say we only use a fraction of our brain's true potential. Now, that's when we're awake. When we're asleep, our mind can do almost anything.
And that's how we got here. Essentially what Christopher Nolan has done here is presented you with continuity editing and tricked you into thinking it's parallel editing. It's part of the reason that it's always important to note that a majority of the storytelling in Christopher Nolan's movies is told through the editing rather than the camera work. Nolan's impeccable sense of narrative composition, coupled with very libertarian screenwriting in terms of its attitude towards what traditionally constitutes story rules, results in what amounts to a genuinely fascinating and intelligently made thought exercise about narrative fiction. That also just happens to be a slickly produced $1 million blockbuster action movie.
Paradox.
Yeah, fuck you, Euclid. So one of the reasons why people may find Inception confusing is because its structure utilises the frame story, or the story within a story. The basic principle of the story within a story is as simple as its common applications are ubiquitous. When a character in a film reads a book, rather than the character reading the story out loud like a strangely grim and jarring episode of Jackanory, a film will visualise the story for us. Flashbacks, such as the several in Man of Steel, are an example of the same concept. Rather than the character recounting their memories orally, we're shown the events of the relative past in a scene. Modern film and televisual storytelling depends heavily on this technique. So does Inception, in a very intricate way, otherwise we'd just be watching these guys fall asleep on a plane for 2 hours. Inception is structured a lot like a series of Russian dolls, with one layer giving away to the next one and so on, and the screenplay makes a point of highlighting the inherent danger of structuring a screenplay this way, as after so many layers it's incredibly easy to get lost. As the characters slip further and further into deeper dream states across the narrative, they run the risk of losing themselves to the fantasy of their surroundings, with the ultimate doom being trapped in limbo, which is ostensibly pure, unmitigated, non-symbolic meta-reality, pure subconscious. So in a sense, the script tries to build a large amount of its tension out of the quality of its own writing. If Inception works, if the idea being planted into the audience's head works, then it's because the story is being conveyed to you well enough so even the most casual viewer can follow along. If it doesn't work, then it's because the film doesn't explain itself clear enough for you. There's that old chestnut of brevity is the soul of wit, and Inception's narrative lives and dies on that very idea. But like I said though, with a screenplay as complex as Inception has, the audience is going to need a very good guide all the way through it, which is in part why the editing is so good and why half the dialogue is really awful. The tell instead of show here is seriously out of control, to the point where half the screenplay is dedicated to explaining how bits of technology in the world work so that when the bad stuff happens it has a sense of weight and meaning. As a result, a lot of the dialogue is really redundant and is in dire need of an editor.
Are you destroying those parts of his mind?
I don't know, they're just projections.
Like, this scene right here is a scene where shit really does not need explaining, especially when your explanation is to the detriment of the pacing. Stuff like this becomes doubly apparent during most of the second act, as character development sequences that stand up well enough on their own are awkwardly positioned as a way to bookend the finale of the last set piece and segue to the next. In a good example, the scene where we're told the half-truth about what happened between him and Mel comes just after a huge car chase featuring a train crashing through the scene and the revelation that Saito is dying, and that the team needs to carry on forwards, otherwise they're going to be stuck in limbo, and just before a faux interrogation sequence as part of the job, getting the screenplay back to your regularly scheduled entertainment. In theory, I have no issue with this scene existing, as it serves towards great character development between Cobb and Ariadne, but functionally this scene serves as a kind of loading screen. Sure, narratively it serves a purpose in as much as it's an opportunity for the audience to take a breath between one barrage of action and the next one, as to help refine Inception's overall well-honed sense of pacing, but it feels particularly strange to me that it's this scene in particular that bridges that gap. But on the whole though, Inception has a fundamentally sound screenplay. In fact, it's my favourite kind of screenplay because it's one that articulates its point even through its own challenges. For instance, one of the mechanics of the plot involves the idea of time stretching longer as further dream states are entered. 5 minutes sleep equals 5 hours dream time and so on. So if we're running with the dreams as filmmaking metaphor, then shouldn't that mean that time is slowing down for the audience as well? Well, actually, yes. I mean, think about it. Under what other circumstances could you witness a car chase, a city folding over itself, a fight in a tilting hotel corridor, a snowmobile chase, and get to know 9 characters' personalities within roughly 2 hours? The idea of time slowing down extends to even seemingly innocuous things like the soundtrack. Earlier we mentioned this track by Edith Piaf, and you should probably remember it because it's the main recurring audio motif in the film. The opening of the track has these rather pleasant trumpets. But if you slow the track down by about half the speed, now where does that sound so familiar? So it's almost as if the runtime of the movie exists as long as the song does in Dreamtime. Although, given Hans Zimmer's influence on pop culture, does that mean that every trailer these days is by extension actually impossibly short? But contemplating that moves us a bit closer towards Tommy Westphal territory, which is where I really don't think we need to be. Anyway, so a majority of the narrative builds itself out of dream logic, placing the audience in a peculiar sense of what constitutes reality and what doesn't, given the shaky nature of both depicted in the movie through Cobb's eyes. After 2.5 hours worth of what's often mischaracterised of Christopher Nolan as gritty realism, which bleeds almost seamlessly with surreal Cocteau-inspired sequences such as that revolving hallway, it's no wonder that it's the film's final moments that really resonate with audiences the strongest. Okay, so now's about time we should talk about the ending and the debate as to whether or not Cobb is dreaming or not at the end, or Schrodinger's cliffhanger as I like to call it. The ending consists of Cobb having successfully completed the job, returning home to his children in a sentimental embrace just before he spins his totem, that of a spinning top, as the final shot pushes in for a medium close-up whilst the top spins continuously and then flickering slightly off balance before the credits begin to roll. This is obviously the thing that everyone's interested in talking about, whether or not Cobb's final scene is reality or not. Nolan deliberately wanted the audience to be uncertain as to whether Cobb is awake, and so in his mind both interpretations are equally true, and furthermore both interpretations are perforce individually incomplete, contributing in concert to the greater whole of the movie's ambiguous, Nolan-esque idea. Sorry, that sentence started out a lot cleverer than it ended. But this hasn't stopped fans arguing over the ending since the film first came out. Well, you know, fan theories, that's what Reddit's for. Still, supposing we were to ignore the deliberate ambiguity of the ending and decide that, as far as we're concerned, the top keeps spinning, i.e. Cobb is actually still dreaming, how could that interpretation affect the whole meaning of the film? I mean, think about it, Cobb might have actually dreamt the entire film.
Come back to reality, Tom.
Continuing this line of thinking, if it is a dream, then his wife Mal might actually have been right, which throws his character through a bit of a loop, if you'll pardon the mangled idioms. It would mean that Mal is actually still alive in the real world and that his guilt and self-punishment is pointless. Of course, from a character point of view, it would mean that Ariadne, Sato, etc. are mere projections, so their stories are potentially void. Although most of the character's development in Inception is Cobb's anyway, as he's the only one in the film that actually gets a real arc. So while Cobb isn't in every scene, would it really be impossible that this is actually just a projection of Cobb's memory of an old colleague kissing another projection, representing an element of Cobb's subconscious he's summoned to guide him towards emotional catharsis? Taking this interpretation to its conclusion, the whole dream is a paranoid fantasy sculpted by a dreamer who's afraid to wake up.
No creeping doubts. Not feeling persecuted, Dom.
Of course, this interpretation also requires the spinning top doesn't really work anyway. But then again, why would it?
I can't let you touch it, that would defeat the purpose. See, only I know the balance and the weight of this particular loaded die.
If he never really woke up after leaving Limbo with Mal and picked up a dream spinning top, a projection of an object which he had never really touched, in a dream hotel room, then it would just act as he has expected it to, or his subconscious drove it to. There's no reason for the top to work as a totem for Cobb. Which then raises the question, what is Cobb's real totem? One popular fan theory is that Cobb's totem is his wedding ring. Eagle-eyed viewers have noticed that Cobb's wedding ring is missing when he's awake, or believes that he's awake, but appears on his hand when he's unambiguously dreaming, reflecting Cobb keeping Mal alive in his mind. Trouble is, while this reappearing ring is a clever little touch of Nolan's and we should all love him for it, it doesn't work as a potential true totem for Cobb, as it can't have been his arrangement before Limbo. I mean, think about it. Before Limbo, he was happily married to his Marion Cotillard lookalike wife Mal. At what point would he have decided my totem is going to be never wearing my wedding ring in real life? I'm sure Mal will be fine with this and not suspect me of having an affair or anything bad. Not exactly a master plan, is it? So as it stands, the nature of Cobb's real totem is a genuine mystery. If he did dream the whole movie, then it clearly isn't something he's carrying now, since it would have shown him the truth. Of course, why did he pick up Mal's totem and start using it? Perhaps, like Leonard in Memento, he's choosing to mislead himself and keep dreaming, quieting his persistent doubts about the bogus reality with a totem that deep down he knows doesn't work, while up in the real world Mal is wiping dribble from his face and hoping he'll come round soon. But you know, that's just one theory. Honestly though, I think Christopher Nolan said the most interesting thing about that scene in that it doesn't really matter. To paraphrase a quote from an interview he did with Entertainment Weekly, it doesn't really matter whether or not it's a dream at all. The most significant thing is that when the top spins, Cobb isn't looking at it. It's more so meant to be a moment of character introspection. Given that the rest of the movie presents both sides in regards to whether reality is more important or dreams are more important, Cobb ultimately doesn't care, just so long as he can be with his children. It's actually a payoff of a scene earlier in the movie where Ariadne finds Cobb wallowing in his tragic memories. Cobb seems to only be able to remember his own children at the moment when he last saw them, which was a moment of deep shame and torment, as he had to leave them behind for a long time to go work abroad, in what almost seems like psychological penance for what he inadvertently did to Mal. And at the end of the film, now that he's been forced to deal with his unfinished business with Mal, that penance is lifted and he's finally allowed to be with his children once again.
Positive emotion trumps negative emotion every time. We all yearn for reconciliation, for catharsis.
The journey into Fisher's subconscious and his own have brought them both the catharsis they needed. So even if the final scene is a dream, it doesn't matter to Cobb because a great weight has been lifted and he's finally allowed to be with the people most dear to him. Ultimately, the greater message with the ending, and what's fundamentally at the core of Inception, is that regardless of fictional reality, both those spaces are made flesh by emotional resonances. And it's those emotional resonances that really matter most, whether that be affection for someone in your life or affection for a bat-themed vigilante. Our dreams, our nightmares, our reality and our fiction all matter because those things push a button in us that make us feel stuff. In this humble film critic / detective's opinion, Inception is Christopher Nolan's best movie by several impeccably thoughtful miles. It's something of a masterclass in pacing and story structure, which is what makes Inception barrel along as a 2.5-hour action movie, and the film never allows itself to get bogged down with explaining itself away with extraneous detail. I mean, sure, for all the hardcore purists out there, it contains science so soft you could spread it on a croissant, but the movie overall was never flawed enough to be a deal breaker, and if you can get past all the clunky exposition, the characters are amazingly well rounded and interesting enough to keep you engaged no matter what. I suppose what I'm saying is that Inception, for all its set-piece grandstanding and philosophical monologuing, could literally fart in my face and I'd still love it. Inception truly is something special and stands unto itself as a hallmark of excellent storytelling and pure craftsmanship as a work of art. In terms of films that remain in the public consciousness long after relevancy, I imagine Inception will be with us for a long, long time. And perhaps that's the point. And on that note, I call that case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, that was Inception, and join us next time for our finale of our retrospective on Christopher Nolan, When the Dark Knight Riseth.